everyone. Thank you for joining us for this second webcast dedicated to the use of AscentialTest. So now I will give the floor to Brian Leswar, CEO of Zinix. Hello, Brian.
Hello, how are you?
I'm
Welcome,
fine,
everyone.
thank you. Okay.
All right, I'm going to show my screen. Sandra, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can see your PowerPoint.
Great.
Great.
All right, well, thank you, everyone, for joining me. I know these are strange times, and you know, I'm thankful for the opportunity that we're able to spend a little time together this morning to talk about AscentialTest. And I know some of you are working from home. I hope your connection is good. If anything does happen where you lose connectivity, don't worry. We're going to be posting this presentation both on PBTV and YouTube. So we'll put an announcement out about that as well. Now, what I'm going to talk about this morning is the interface that we have with tables. And I think most of you know that when you're dealing with a table in AscentialTest, you're dealing with a complex object. It's not as easy as dealing with a push button or a text field. There's a little bit more to it. And so we get a lot of questions about the table interface. So I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail during this presentation. I'm going to explain how you can get or verify the contents of a column, for example, or get and verify the contents of a row, and then the same thing for a table. I'm going to talk about how you can get the number of rows in a table, how you can get the number of columns. I'll explain how to select a row or a column, or set a value to an element that's embedded in a table cell or a table column. We'll also talk about iterating through table rows. Now, what I'm going to do today is, most of you know that I like to use video when I make presentations, but I decided this time I was going to do everything live. So I've got a copy of an application up right now. This happens to be a Power Builder application. But what I'm about to talk about is not really specific to Power Builder. In fact, I'm going to start out using Power Builder as my target, but then I'm going to switch over to a RenderText table because I think a lot of you are probably also building tables with RenderText. So you're going to be able to see the contrast of how you deal with the table when it's in Power Builder. And this would apply directly to .NET as well, because in terms of tables, AscentialTest works very much the same for a Power Builder table or a .NET table. RenderText is a little bit of a different animal, so we're going to talk about that as well. So I have my Power Builder application here, and I've got this data window that we're going to deal with select customers that we're going to deal with several of our examples. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to take you through, like I said, I'm going to take you through a whole bunch of different examples. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about how you can get or verify the contents of a column. So let me just close here. I'm going to just make a little bit more room and make things as large as I can so that you can see them. Okay. I guess I need my Project Explorer here so that I can select my steps. So we're going to look at, again, getting or verifying the contents of a column. We're going to do that first. And we're going to do that using the Power Builder sample. Now, here, I've given you a couple of different options. You can see that we have an action called getText that would work. And we also have a property called text. So these are two different ways of doing the exactly same thing. You see here that I've got my select customer, which is the dialog box, .customers, which is the table, .row. And now what I do here is I say all. Most of you probably know that all is a keyword that will get me all. It will match all of the rows. Then I'm interested in the column. I'm interested in this column here. This is called the ID column, where the customer ID is. So I'm using my selector to select all the rows, but I'm specifically getting the text of the ID column, and then I simply print it. I'm going to run this for you. In fact, I'll run all of the samples for you. But before I do that, I want to point out that there's a little difference when you're using the property. You'll notice here that when I called getText, I did not have to cast what came back from getText to the list of strings that I want to capture the list of customer IDs in. But if I'm using the property, then I do need to cast it to a list of string before I assign it. So if I run this, you can see that what we got was a list of the IDs, so 101, 102, 103, etc. You can see the list. And if I scroll down, you'll see that from the property, we got exactly the same thing. So not too difficult to get a list of the values in a column, as long as you know that you can use the action getText, or you could use the property text. Again, two ways of doing the same thing. Now let's take a look at how you would get, or actually, let's do a verify. We'll do the verify of the contents of the column, since we're talking about columns. So this is similar. You'll notice here I did the same getText that I did just a moment ago when I was doing the get, but now I want to verify it. Now what I'm purposely doing is I'm passing in an empty list. So when I compare it to what is actually going to be gotten, there's going to be an error, but that's okay. I just want to show you what that looks like. So I'm going to just click OK. I'm not going to try to pass the data in, so it would take too long for me to type it in front of you. But what I want you to see is that when you do the verify value, you're passing in the actual result, which is what you got from the getText, ls customer IDs. You're passing in a parameter that represents the expected list. And you see that when the comparison occurs, you get this little symbol in the results file. And it does say verify value column contents failed. That's where it got the verbiage column contents. You can see it right there, column contents. But if I click on this little icon, watch what happens. This viewer pops up, and you can see, in this case, it's a little artificial because I didn't pass anything in, but you can see all the ones that failed. So had I passed in a set of expected values, you'd only see the pink show up, the shading, or this reddish pink shading on the cells where it did not match. In this case, none of them matched because I predicted nothing. So you can see that verifying and getting the contents of a column is pretty similar. Once you get it, you can then compare it using the verify value. Now let's look at the same thing for a row. So if I want to get the contents of a row, you can see I'm using something called values. Now you'll see this is not available in RenderText, so you're going to see a little bit of a difference here. So here I'm saying values. So I'm getting in customer row, I'm getting row values by passing in a value. So I'm passing in 102. I'm using a selector to select the row, and then I'm going to be printing the values. So let me run that for you. And so here you see that what I got was all the values in this particular row. So 102, Beth, Riser, AMF Corp, etc. So that's how we get the values of a row using a selector. Now, of course, I didn't name the selector here. I probably should have. I should have done my select by value and named the column. But since there's only one selector for this particular row, then that works okay as well. We'll see other examples where I actually specify the selector. Now let's look at the verify. So in this case, I did predict the expected result. And you can see I did a verify values, and verify values is going to prompt me for the expected result. So I put in the expected result. I'm specifying, in this case, an index selector. So it's just going to be the first row. I could have used a selector there if I wanted to in order to select a specific row, but I'm wanting to show you different ways of using selectors as I go through this. So here again, you see that little symbol. Well, that symbol means that there was a comparison of complex data. So I'm going to click on it, and you notice again that the viewer opens. And so you can see that what was expected and what was actually returned are the same. Now, I can purposely cause that to fail, of course. I can put an X or something there and then run it again, just so that you can see when it does fail, here's your difference viewer. And notice that the fields that don't match, the columns that don't match, light up in red. Okay, so we've covered getting and verifying the contents of a column and a row. Now let's look at a table. So I'm going to get the table contents first. Now here, in order to use this, you must enable metadata. So I'm going to make AscentialTest larger for just a moment, just so I can show you, because not everyone is familiar with metadata, I have learned. And so let's do this. I'll go over to my test workspace. I'm going to add in the snapshot. And I want the snapshot of, there we go, of my customers. And what I want you to see is that I've enabled the metadata. So here's the metadata editor. And I'll click on my select customers here in my app objects. And you'll notice that what I did was I checked off customers row. And what that did is it enabled the metadata for this particular object, for this PB table in this case. Once I do that, I can then use the value property. So let's see how that works. I'm just going to save some room again so that you can see. So let me go ahead and run this. And so you can see that I was able to get the contents of the entire table. So I'm catching it in a list of customers row, which was created automatically when I enabled the metadata. So you don't have to define this type. This type got defined automatically as soon as I checked that checkbox in the metadata. So then I'm calling value, and then I'm printing it. Now, there are two ways to do this again. I could have said value, or I could say rows. So I'm giving you two ways of doing the exact same thing. And if I scroll down again, you can see that it's been repeated. So I've done it twice. Here's the second time. It's essentially doing the same thing. You can see in this case, it's calling get value. And I think in this case, it's calling get values. Oh, I just went by it. It's easy to miss. There we go. Yeah. But again, essentially the same thing. Now, to verify the table contents, let's look at that one. This one's kind of interesting. Again, in order to use this, you have to enable the metadata, like I showed you. And you can see that here, I'm getting the value again, and then I'm using our verify value in order to compare. Now, this would work fine if the data in the table is going to vary. In other words, you're always going to have to predict a different set of expected results. So if you want to do that, you're going to want to use verify value. We have another approach, and we did this actually for a specific customer a long time ago. I don't know how many of you have tried to use this. In this case, we're actually capturing the expected result right out of the snapshot when you create this statement. And if I click on this, you can see that the expected results is actually captured here. Now, people have asked, can I edit it? You cannot edit it here. However, if you did look at this in the source editor, you would see that this happens to be like a list, a record, and you would be able to edit it. So it is editable, just not currently in the high-level editor. You'd have to do that in the source editor. But let me go ahead and run this one for you. And again, I'm not going to predict anything, so we're going to get failure, at least on the first one. So on the first one, because I didn't predict anything, you can see that everything failed. But on the second one, where we had encoded or captured the expected result, and we did it off of the current snapshot right before, so I know it's going to match, you can see that everything matches. So again, pretty easy to deal with the whole table as long as you know about the metadata and you know about the different actions that you need to call. Okay, now let's talk about number of rows. This is something that we commonly get questions about. And when you're using Power Builder or .NET, it's actually quite easy to do, because you're going to find that there are properties that will allow you to do that. So here I have some options. I can either use a property, num rows. I can use attributes. So I can either use the format of get attribute with the num rows, or I can simply use the @ sign, again, with num rows. These are equivalent, just two different notations for the same thing. And so if I run this, you'll see that we're going to get 126, the number of rows. Now you'll see that when we switch over to RenderText, this is not so easy, right? It's very easy to do this in platforms like .NET or Power Builder, because there's an actual table element. There really is a table there. This gets a little bit trickier when you move over to the web, and this is really just built based on web blocks or things like that. But I'm going to show you how you can get the number of rows and so forth from those as well. You just have to work a little harder. You don't have a property or an attribute that we can provide to you. And then again, the number of columns, pretty similar. In fact, very similar. You'll see we have a num columns property, or we have the attribute num cols. And so if I run this, you'll see that we got 9 columns, which is what we have in our table. Okay, now what I want to do, excuse me, is I want to talk about setting a value in an embedded table. So here I'm going to use this data window right here. And let me just remove the quantity, because that's what I'm going to be putting in. And so we're going to set a value. And so I'm using my selector, and notice I did it properly this time. I've used the name of the selector. So I'm saying select by item, and I'm giving it the row ID. In this case, I'm using the ID. And I'm going to set the item quantity field to the number 3, and the item field is hiding right here. And so I'm going to use that action. So I'm going to set the value of the item quantity field to 3 based on the selector 301. Well, there is only one row right now in this particular table, but you get the idea. Whoops. What happened there? Oh, I see. I got an error from the application, but that's okay. We did set the 3, so that's how the 3 got into that field there. So again, not a difficult thing to do, as long as you know you use the set action with the selector. Now I have one more example that I want to do on Power Builder before I switch over and start doing examples with RenderText. And that's something that we commonly get questions about. Now this one's a little bit trickier, so I'm going to explain what's going on here. And let me bring up my customers again. So in order to iterate through this table, what I need is I need a for loop. And we have a special for loop. We call it for each, because what it does, it goes through a list, and it iterates through a list, selecting each item one at a time. Now, if I'm going to make AscentialTest larger so that you can see this. Most of you know, I think, that you actually have to type for loops, or for that matter, in the level editors, simply drag. So in order to get a for loop that I'm going to use, I grab this one right here. So it says for, and then you can see that it says in. So it's basically for each item in the list is how I would interpret that if I was to read it. And so here what I've done is I've got a list of names, and I've got my for loop. So I say for app object AO, that's just my abbreviation for app object, in the list of customers, and notice I'm using the selector all. So that means I'm going to select all of the rows, and I'm going to iterate. That's what this loop does, is it's going to go through each one of these rows one at a time, and it's going to assign. So this names, by the way, is a record that I had already created. So I created a record that has first name and last name. And I'm going to call the get text on ao.fname, the first name, get the text, and I'm going to assign it to the first name field of my record. So I go through and I assign one at a time, each row at a time, the first name and the last name. And then I simply take and add this record to my list of record, and then I'm going to print it. So I'll just go ahead and run that for you. And you'll see a whole lot of these, right? You're going to see a whole lot of get text. Why? Because we went flying through this table and did a get text on every single row. And notice all the rows are listed here because I said all. So it went through the entire table, and then it produced this list of record, which was my names. And you can see Michael Stevlin, Beth Reiser, and so forth. So again, this one's a little trickier in order to iterate through a table. But once you have an example like this, you can follow that example, and you wouldn't have any, I don't think you'd have any difficulty. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We will revisit Power Builder for RenderText in a little bit, but I'm going to make AscentialTest larger again. And what I want to do now is I'm going to show you a snapshot. Now, because I don't actually have this application anymore, this is an application that we used at one point, but we lost track of it. But we have a simulator. I think some of you know that. And we use that in support to simulate issues that you might log in with, that you might call in with. And so since we don't have your application, we often ask you for a snapshot, because with a simulator, we can actually do an awful lot with just a snapshot. So I'm going to go through now, and I'm going to explain the exact same things that I explained in Power Builder, but I'm going to do that with RenderText, and I'm going to use the simulator. So what that means is that when I run these examples for you, you won't actually see anything happen because I'm not using a real application. I'm simulating an application using a snapshot. By the way, for those of you that don't know this, this is a tool that's available to you as well. We built it for ourselves in tech support so that we could support you with just your snapshots. But let's just say, for example, you were working offline and you didn't have the application. You could always use this simulator in order to do your gets, test your gets. You can't do anything to the application because it's not the real application. So you can't set a value, but you can do anything that gets a value. So you can test some of your actions or your steps using the simulator. So what I'm going to do here, let me just again make a little bit of room, is I'm going to use the simulator in order to explain how we're going to do all of those same exact actions that we did against the Power Builder application. We're going to do them against this using RenderText. Excuse me. So if I was to look at the objects here, you'd see that my little music organizer is made up of RenderText. That's all these particular fields are. There's no real objects there. We just used RenderText because this was some custom application. I can't remember the platform. And so it's all built with RenderText using a class. So we created a class and a row and then all the columns in the row, but it's all built with RenderText. Okay, again, I'm just going to make a little bit more room. Excuse me. And so here, what I want to do is I want to get the contents of a column. So I'm going to get the contents of a RenderText column using the simulator. And you see that I have a list of string. I call it list of songs, because that's what this is a music organizer. And you can see that I'm using, again, one of those for each loops that I talked about a little while ago. And so I'm going to iterate through the table. You're going to see this pattern a lot. We don't have these properties or these attributes like we do in a real table, like a .NET table or a Power Builder table. So we have to really do it ourselves. So you see there's a little more work involved, but it's not difficult to do once you know the pattern. So I'm saying for each object in the table, I'm going to get all the rows. I'm going to get the text of each one of the songs. So I'm in this column here, the song column, and then I'm going to simply print the list. So let's again make a little more room. I'm going to run, and if I pull this up, you can see here's the list of songs that were in this particular column. Since I used all, I didn't use a selector, I'm going to get all of them. Okay, now I'm going to do the same thing with a row. Now with a row, you can use the metadata. I might have misspoke earlier when I was talking about row. Because we still have the metadata, and I'll bring that up in a second so that you can see it again, I can use the values action in order to get the value. So getting from a row is pretty easy in RenderText thanks to the metadata editor. So let me go here. Let's look at metadata. So you can see that I did enable the metadata for our row. Once you do that, it means that you can use values. So it's pretty easy to get the values of a row. And you can see again here, I'm using the correct syntax, what I call the best practice syntax for the selector, where I actually name the selector. So I'm saying music organizer dot track listing, that's the table, dot row. I'm selecting a row, and then I'm getting the values of the row, and then I'll print them for you. So if I run this, then I have to put in, a song choice. So, I'll just put in the shortest one, I'll put in bad. And when I run it, you see that we got all of the values in the row that was located using the selector, select by song choice, with the value of bad. So we got 8, Michael Jackson, bad, and so on and so forth. Okay, so again, the metadata makes this much easier than it would have been. We would have had to write a loop through, but using the metadata, that's pretty easy to do. Okay, now let's look at the contents of a table. Again, using the metadata makes it pretty easy. This isn't that different than what I did before. It's just that we're using the all selector, so it's selecting all of the rows. So if I run this, you see that what we do is we get a list of track listing row, which is again from the metadata. I did not have to define that record. That was defined automatically when I checked the metadata. We can see it again right here. You see track listing row. This was already in the metadata editor. All I had to do was put the check here and it checked everything off. So AscentialTest automatically generated that track listing row based on what we called our row, which was called track listing. You can see that right here. And so what we end up with is a list of track listing row, which includes all of the columns in the row. Okay, now let's talk about, again, number of rows and number of calls. And you'll see that here, again, the metadata makes this relatively easy, because what we can do is we can use values to get all of the rows into a list of string. And then we can simply call count. So again, I did calls. I'm sorry. I meant to do rows first. Let me talk about rows. There we go. So rows is a little bit harder. We're going to use the loop. So what I'm doing here is I've got a list of string, and I'm in that for each loop. I'm using my all selector, and then one by one, I'm adding the values to my list of string, and then simply counting my list of string. So you see all those gets happen inside the loop, and then finally the value 31. So I went through using the for each, one row at a time, added it to my list, and then simply counted my list. Now I'll go back to the columns, which is what I had incorrectly started explaining here. I want to get the number of columns, and I can use the metadata and get the row, and then again simply count. So if I run that, I have to put in a song choice, right? Because I've got to select my row, and then based on the row, and I could have put in any row, right? Because it's the same number of columns. It then correctly told me how many columns I have. Okay, so let's see what we have left here. Now, obviously I can't select a row here, so I'm going to use something a little bit different. I'm going to go back and use the Power Builder application, but I'm not using the Power Builder API. I could have, because obviously it exists, but because I wanted to teach, again, RenderText, and I'm going to explain this in a little bit more detail. Let me just give myself a little bit of room. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use RenderText, but I'm going to use it to locate a row in this. So basically, it's a data window. But again, I'm not going to use the API. I defined this using RenderText. And so the trick is you've got to figure out when you've reached the bottom. And there's a number of ways that you can do this. I decided to just say how many tries I'm going to use in order to find my target string, how many times I will try. Another possibility would have been to look at the scroll bar and look at its max position, and when I got to the max position, I could get out of my loop. So I just want you to know that there's a number of ways that this could have been done, but I'll explain the way I decided to do it. So I created an integer, I max tries, and I set it to 25. That's way more than I need. And what I wanted to do here was I wanted to change the resolve timeout. I didn't want to wait the default, which is 5 seconds, every single time I wanted to scan what was visible, because that would just be kind of slow. So I'm capturing what the original resolve timeout was so that I could later set it back. But you'll see inside of my loop, I'm just setting it to 1. So it's just going to be 1 second. I probably didn't even really need a second. Then I've got an integer on the tries, how many times I'm going to try. So I set my try equal to 1. Remember, my max tries is 25. And then I say while true, so that would stay in the loop forever unless I had another condition, and my try is less than the max number of tries. And you'll see I'm going to increment I try every time I go through the loop. So I set the resolve timeout to 1, and then I try to find, I'm in a try catch, I try to select the value that I pass in. So I'm using the selector, select by text. I'm going to give it some item text. And when I demonstrate this to you, I will provide the item text as a parameter. And what I want to do is I want to click on that row. Now, if I successfully click on the row, I'm going to break. I'm going to get out of my loop. But if I can't find the value, the try is going to pass the execution over to the catch. And what I'm doing in my catch is I'm paging down. So that's how I'm getting through my list. I'm going to page down, page down, page down until I get a match. And then finally at the end, I want to set my resolve timeout back to whatever it was before. So I'm getting it, saving it so that I could reset it. Now, if I run this for you, I'm going to be prompted for a name, and I'm going to put something in that's fairly, it's down fairly low in the list. So I'm going to put in Taylor Ann, and I'm going to run it. And you'll see that I'm trying to, I'll run it again for you because that was kind of fast. I scrolled down until I found Taylor Ann. So let me go ahead and run that for you one more time so you can see it. So I'm going through my loop. I didn't find it on the first time. I scrolled down once, I didn't find it, and then finally I did find it. And then I get out of my loop because of the break here. As soon as the click is successful, I break out of the loop. When I tried to click on the item before, when I was not scrolled into view, I would get an error that AscentialTest could not find the object, which would drive me into the catch, causing me to scroll down. So again, not difficult to do as long as you know the pattern. I know some of you on this call have challenged me with this problem where we actually had a data window that was implemented as a tree view, which is kind of interesting. And instead of using the actual Power Builder tree view, it was a data window in a mode that, I think it was a tabular mode, but it looked like a tree view. So we used an approach similar to this, and that worked out really well. That actually was what gave me the inspiration for showing this technique on this data window right here. Let me just see if I missed anything. So we've talked about getting the contents of a column and a row and a table, the number of rows. I don't think I did my verifies. Yeah, so let me do the verifies for you. So here we're going to be back in the mode where we're using our simulator. So let me just put that in front of you so you can see it. can make it a little bit larger too, make it a little bit easier to see. And so again, here I'm going to use my simulator, and I've got my list and my all. And of course, when I run this, it's going to fail because I'm not predicting anything. So I'm doing a verify value on the song list, but I'm not predicting anything. My list is empty, and I'm getting the songs. And again, if I click on this here, just like what we saw in Power Builder, you have the same thing in RenderText. You can see the actual values versus the expected values. So that was the values of a RenderText column. And then here's the verifying the contents of a row. Okay, that's going to use the PB sample. I'll skip that one for right now. I'll focus on the ones from the simulator. So here we're doing again a verify, and I'll put my song choice in, and I used bad. And so here you can see the viewer where we're comparing the actual to the expected, and everything matched just fine. And the contents of the whole table. Again, we're going to get a big failure here because I'm not going to predict anything. So you can see the entire contents of the table being compared to the empty list because I passed it in as a parameter and I didn't assign it anything. Now, again, you need to enable the metadata in order to use this approach. And it looks like I have one more example that I want to show you. And this one was, which one was it here? Yeah, here we are. We're back to using the Power Builder application, but again, RenderText. So here, I've got my list of string employees. Let me make this smaller again so that you can see the actual application. So here's my list of employees over here on the left. And I'm going to use the all selector in order to get the all the employees from the RenderText row. And I'm using getText and adding it to my list of string. So I'm building a list of string by pulling off the employees and putting them in a list, and then finally just verifying the values of the employees. And I'm not going to predict anything, so again, we're going to get a failure. But you can see that it captured all the list of all the employees. Now this would be only the ones in view, because remember this is RenderText, and then compared it to the expected value. So if you wanted to do this for the whole table, you would have to implement something like what I had before, where you kept scrolling down, scrolling down, scrolling down until you got to the bottom. Okay, so just to kind of summarize, let me go back and talk about where we've talked about getting and verifying the contents of a column, and we did that with both Power Builder and RenderText. We did the same thing with the row, getting and verifying the contents of a row, getting and verifying the contents of an entire table, getting the number of rows, getting the number of columns. We talked about how to select a row or a column, and then setting the value of an element embedded in a column, and then finally iterating through the table rows.